Good evening, friends. It's Friday once again, and I'm back with the sequel to last week's story, City Underground. I hope you enjoyed that story, and I hope your 2021 is off to a good start. Now it's time to grab a snack, dim the lights, and let me take you into the night with a story I call Return to City Underground. Sitting at my desk, I watched as the slideshow dissolved through picture after picture of satellite images I copied from the internet. They were all of the same area, starting in 1978, until it finally stopped on 2020. I was looking at Stevensville, Michigan, where I attended junior high school 42 years ago. As the pictures advanced, each one paused for 10 seconds, and I noted what changed and what stayed the same, while at the same time, reflecting on what I had been doing in each year since leaving there so long ago. All of my life I've been haunted by what happened to me at the end of October 1978. I told everyone I visited a city underground, but no one believed me, and the doctors said I was just confused after having an accident during what was a very traumatic year for a 12-year-old. In the spring, I climbed off the school bus at home on my father's birthday and was greeted by the blaring sirens of fire trucks. I watched as they went past the bus stop and turned into my long driveway toward our old farm. Following quickly, I was intercepted and made to stay at my great-aunt's house across the street while the firemen worked to try and save our farmhouse. It burned to the ground, and everything was lost except the clothes I was wearing. I finished the school year living in a weekly motel until we moved to a smaller farm in a nearby town at the beginning of summer. There, I met a girl a little older than me, whose father owned a riding stable on their property. I spent the summer helping her care for the horses and take clients for rides in the nearby state park. It was a wonderful time that ended abruptly when my father packed us out the day before my birthday and we were off on a midnight move. When I awoke in the morning in the backseat of the car, we were in Stevensville, Michigan. My father was talking to a man outside of a body shop, and I knew he was getting a job there. I had seen this before, several times. Then he rented the downstairs level of a house converted to apartments next to a grocery store. I guess I adapted okay. Before school started, I made a couple of friends in the neighborhood and explored the community thoroughly on my bike. Our upstairs neighbor was a divorcee who lived with his girlfriend. Every other weekend, his two boys stayed with him, and we became fast friends. I spent a lot of time fishing on Lake Michigan since it was only a half-mile away from the house. There were monstrous sand dunes to climb and play on, and a very large patch of woods next to the peach orchard where I could bow hunt small game and pheasant. Sometimes, while fishing or playing in the dunes, I would see other kids from the town playing on the beach, and it was always fun to watch the girls. There were several I thought I might like to get to know, and as it turned out, one of them was in my math class when I started school. We hit it off from the start, and soon I was learning more about the town as I spent time with her, just walking around, exploring and talking. It helped to talk about the things that happened over the course of the year, and life began to seem stable again. I also got a part-time job at the body shop where my dad worked. I would go in after school to clean and mask cars which were to be painted, or unmask and detail those that were already painted. It was fun, because after I got all the tape and paper off of a painted car, it was my job to drive it around the building to the wash rack. Once there, I would wash and vacuum the cars and get them ready to be presented to the owners. Sometimes an owner would see me getting their car ready, and I would receive a tip. Not too bad for a 12-year-old. Having a job meant I could afford to take my girlfriend roller skating or to a movie. Of course, I couldn't drive around town, so we were always picked up and dropped off by our parents. Usually it was her mom, as my parents were typically at the bar on Friday evenings. One weekend, after spending Sunday with her and going to church, I returned home to prepare for the coming week as a snowstorm began. That night, I watched the snow falling and was sure there would be no school the following day. But there was. I overslept, missed the school bus, and ended up having to walk to school. Along the way, I stopped to play at the creek where I had my accident. While leaning to look into a hole beneath a large tree, I fell in. The doctor said I hit my head on the boulder I was found laying on 3 days later, but that's not what I remember. I fell into water in an underground aqueduct and was carried to a city underground. They repaired the aqueduct and returned me to the hole after wiping my memory of the city. I spent a long time in the hospital, and when I returned home, my parents felt it would be best if we left the area entirely. They said we were moving to get me away from the traumatic experience, but considering it was another midnight move, which gave me no time to say goodbye to friends, I think they were running from dead again. I came home from school to find a small trailer hooked up to my dad's van in the front yard and was immediately put to work loading our belongings. Not much, really, since the apartment was furnished when we moved in. We relocated to the Gulf Coast of Texas, where I continued working part-time in my father's auto body shop while we embraced life on the Gulf Coast. My father purchased a small house on the bayou, and it wasn't long before we started building a shrimp boat. Learning that saltwater fishing was vastly different from the freshwater fishing I was used to helped push the memories of Michigan away. While I never forgot about what happened in Michigan, I tried to believe what the doctors said and moved on with my life. Eventually, I joined the Army, met a wonderful girl, got married, and started a family. When I got out of the Army, I worked construction with her father for many years in addition to opening an electronics shop. Sometimes, on laid-back melancholy evenings, I would remember the city underground and wonder if it was really just a dream. Even if it wasn't, it didn't really matter. There was no reason for me to go back there. I had everything I needed. My wife and family, with our cats and home. For many years, it became just another story to be told around the campfire. Life has a way of moving on, and time seems to pass much more quickly the older you get. Now my children are grown and moved away with families of their own. My parents and in-laws have passed on, and my wife has also completed her journey. One of my sons came to live with us when my wife needed help around the house, and he's still here. The work situation is far from ideal, as we're still dealing with the outbreak of 2020, so sharing the bills has made things a little easier. While going through our belongings and sorting things out as I cleaned, I came across an old story I wrote many years ago about the city underground. I sat back in the corner of my walk-in closet, under the watchful eye of my old tomcat, and read the yellowed pages. It all came back to me as the words seemed to jump off the page, sparking the old memories. I can recall every detail of that quote-unquote dream adventure, and honestly, it feels pretty real. I have no real reason to stay here, and it might be an interesting adventure. One last hurrah, you might say, if I could go back and find that place, that city underground. So here I am, looking at Google Earth to see if there are any clues where I might gain access to the city underground. The old creek where I used to play is still there, but the bridge has been rebuilt and the big oak tree is no longer on the bank. The place where I think the tree was is just a smooth dirt embankment. Not that I would want to try to re-enter by that route anyway. I'm too old to be swimming in icy water, and don't know if I could haul myself out before getting sucked down by the whirlpool at the turbine input. No, I've done a lot of thinking about it, and I'm sure if the place exists, there has to be a way in from some structure above ground. I was told they got their television feeds from a house on the surface, but that can't be the only supplies they would need. While I did see plenty of evidence of horticulture, the growing of plants, I saw no livestock. Sure, it's possible they get fish from underground springs that connect with Lake Michigan, but what about meat and poultry? I remember seeing people eating bacon and eggs when I was there. Where did they come from? As I study the satellite images, I notice there's a patch of woods that has remained pretty much unchanged for the last 40 years. The town has grown a lot, and there are now neighborhoods where there used to be hundreds, if not thousands, of acres of farmland. The creek I used to play in also runs through this forest. Zooming in for a closer look, I'm not surprised to find the area around the creek is a nature area. The area is actually very large compared to the subdivisions surrounding it. There's another smaller area to the east, which is half plowed for crops, but the large wood lot to the southern end is woods that have remained untouched for the last 40 years. The borders of the city go right out until they touch the surrounding communities with no outlying undeveloped areas. But that patch of forest remains unchanged, and at the edge of the forest to the north is a very large warehouse complex with excellent access to the interstate. Sitting back in my chair, I consider what I'm seeing. If I were there and wanted to remain unnoticed, a warehouse with ties to the community would be ideal. Products come in on trucks to be distributed, and a portion could be retained for the city underground. The warehouse structure also has a cell phone tower built on the property, which could provide for any communication needs, including internet and television. Since the city's built in caverns, it would be best if very little construction was done above to prevent cave-ins and sinkholes. The nature area ensures this. I'm convinced I've found a way in. Now it remains to figure out how to get in. I was told I would be welcome back should I ever find a way to return. It stands to reason that if the city does actually exist, the warehouse I see would be the perfect cover. But it's not like I can just walk in and say, "Hey, I know about the city, let me in." It seems likely only a few people working in the warehouse would actually know the city exists. The rest would be from the surrounding community. Otherwise, the community at large would wonder where these strangers who work at the warehouse live. The few who are privy to the information would not necessarily be noticed because people don't know everything about their co-workers, and not all of them will associate outside business hours. No, entry would have to be clandestine until I reach the point of no return. Once I'm among the people of the city, then I'll be okay. I'll have to think about this. I finished cleaning the house and going through our stuff. In my closet, there are a few boxes of keepsakes for my children, and I've given a lot of things to charity. I talked with my son and let him know I'm turning the house over to him until my return. He thinks I'm returning to the Midwest to revisit old childhood places and do a little fishing in places I went to as a kid. I didn't let him know exactly what I'm doing because Lord knows he would think I'm crazy for going off to find a hidden city. And maybe I am a little crazy, but I have to know for sure. This is something that's been in my head for over 40 years, and I have a need to know. Just in case I don't make it back, I've left my will and supporting documents with him. I put a bag of clothes and personal items in my truck, along with a fishing pole and tool bag of essentials. I made sure I have enough cash in case I have any trouble with my bank cards on the trip, and I set out on the drive from Texas to Michigan. I only have a simple plan for when I get there. I will find a place to watch the warehouse and observe what happens there. While I can't see what's in the trucks as they come and go, I hope to find an area where I can watch the loading docks so I can estimate the amount of cargo coming in and going out. If my hunch is right, there should be less going out than comes in. This is the first part of my plan. I also plan to try to sneak inside and check the place out. My hope is there will be very little security and I'll be able to slip in after dark when everyone goes home for the night. We'll see how it goes. In my younger days, I could make the drive from Texas to Michigan in one shot, stopping only for gas and food. Now, I find myself getting tired after only 8 hours of driving, and have started to look for a motel for the night. It's okay. I'm not in a hurry and don't have any place to be, but there is an anxious excitement which is driving me. The motel is a dark little place at the edge of Blythesville, Arkansas, and I have pushed on past when I started getting tired to at least get more than halfway. Now I'm tired, and I don't really care what kind of place the motel is, as long as it's not in a bad area where I have to worry about my truck. I pay the man at the desk, and on entering the room, fall into the bed. I fell asleep before I could even get undressed or have a bite to eat. I woke up feeling ravenously hungry and realized I haven't eaten since stopping for gas the previous afternoon. After a quick shower, I walked outside to find there's a small cafe adjacent to the motel. I want to get on the road and consider just hitting a drive-thru for a quick bite, but I'd also like a homemade meal that I didn't have to cook. This little cafe looks like a mom and pop joint. They might have pretty good coffee, too. The coffee was excellent, and they even had the hazelnut creamer I like. I ordered steak and eggs and was surprised to find my steak had the bone left in. Somebody here understands eating, but one of my favorite parts of a good steak is to chew the last of the meat off the bone. I don't know why, but it's always the tastiest part. Despite the great food, I still had trouble sitting and relaxing to eat. I felt like a little kid whose mom said they could go out and play with a new toy after they finished lunch. I drank the last of the coffee as I stood to leave and left the waitress a nice tip with my payment. The need to get rolling was pushing me onward. The sun was just above the eastern horizon when I pulled out of the motel. Birds were singing and everything felt all right. Pointing the truck north, I got on the highway and set the cruise control. It occurred to me that I should take time to enjoy the sights along the way, as I may not ever pass this way again. Then I went back to studying the map in my mind and thinking about my plan as I drove. I hadn't really progressed in my planning when I realized the turn onto I-80 East was coming up. The day had passed quickly, and it was now early afternoon. I made good time, stopping only once to get fuel and some microwave burritos for lunch. For a few moments I thought about continuing on north to Chicago. I hadn't been there since I was in grade school, and a nostalgic desire to go to the planetarium and natural history museum rose in me. Then I remembered we are still dealing with the virus, and most public places like that are closed to the public to prevent mass gatherings. It was disheartening. I took the ramp onto I-80 and continued on. The surroundings began to look and feel familiar as I drove on, so I decided to get off the highway and take the scenic route across northern Indiana. I was only 60 or so miles from my destination, and a memory from long ago resurfaced. When we left Michigan, my girlfriend wasn't aware of where I was until I called her from Texas a few weeks later. She told me of going to my house looking for me, since I hadn't come around to go to the beach, and was shocked to see the place was empty. I explained I had no choice in the matter, going on at length about the sudden move, and assured her that I still felt the same about her. We agreed to stay in touch and find a way to reconnect after we graduated from high school in 4 years. We talked on the phone every couple weeks for the first year or so, but then it became hit or miss whether she would be home when I called. Long-distance calls on a payphone were expensive back then, and after missing her several calls in a row, I decided to write. At first, she would answer every letter, and I would respond within a couple days. Then it became weeks before she responded, and finally it was going on 2 months waiting for her next letter when my parents decided to make another midnight move. I won't bore you with the details, but let me just say things weren't going so well for my parents in the months before this move. Alcohol has a bad way of messing things up, and the next thing I knew, I was in Pensacola, Florida for a few months, before finding myself in Lake Station, Indiana. My father got my mother and us kids a place to stay while he went back to Texas to get us set up there again. To make matters worse, it was the middle of winter, and I hadn't lived in the cold for over 3 years. I had acclimated to the hot southern sun and was not used to the cold anymore. Winter finally gave way to spring, and I managed to find enough small work to buy myself a nice 10-speed bicycle. Then one fine spring morning, I set off on the longest bike ride of my life. I was headed for Stevensville, Michigan, 60 miles away. I arrived in Stevensville at my girlfriend's house about 4 o'clock in the evening. Her mother, father, and sister greeted me warmly. I asked where my girlfriend was, and they said she would be there soon, as they had called her when they saw me coming up the drive. We sat and chatted for a bit until a car pulled up and she came in. I noticed the car was still running and wondered why. To say it was amazing to see her after 3 years would be a lie. She saw me and came to give me a hug, but I cannot tell you what the look on her face was. I was too busy staring at my virgin when I left girlfriend's belly. She was at least 8 months pregnant, and I knew I had made a terrible mistake coming back. We chatted for a few minutes, but I can't tell you about what. The only thing I truly remember is her saying that she could only stay for a few minutes because her boyfriend was outside with the motor running, and then she was gone. I said goodbye to her family and got on the bike for the return trip. There was no one else here that I wanted to see, so I began the longest ride of my life. I arrived home about 3 a.m. and slept for the next day. Looking around, I realized I had gone into autopilot as I was already halfway across Lake Station on Central Drive. The next hour was spent easing around the coast of Lake Michigan on Highway 20 and then crossing over onto Highway 12. As I passed the places I knew from childhood, I reflected on the memories with a smile, just enjoying the ride. Several times I was tempted to stop and explore old places, but resisted the urge to prevent disappointment. All of my life I've heard you can never go back, and though I often found myself in the same places trying to disprove this, it never fails that what I return to is never the same. Sure, some places don't change much, but I learned a long time ago that it's the feeling the places inspire that won't return. Places are just places, and returning to them expecting to feel what was felt before is disappointing. In truth, it's not the places that are special in our memories. It's the events, people, and experiences that make a place something to long for. With this in mind, I returned my focus to driving. Highway 12 became the Red Arrow Highway, and I knew I was approaching my destination. I was really here and going to see if what I remembered was real. Or would this return be another disappointment? The thought stuck with me, and I realized that I truly would be disappointed if it was just a dream. A city underground was far-fetched and a fantastic idea. But what if? Once again, it was early evening as I returned to Stevensville looking for something I left there. There were a lot of new businesses and homes now, but it still felt comfortable and familiar. The old motels I remembered were no longer there, and it was necessary to go almost all the way to my old home before I found one in my price range. After registering, I put my bag in the room and went to find something to eat. The excitement was tangible now, but I knew I needed to eat and rest before beginning. There was a country-style restaurant just up the street which I like to eat at back in Texas, and it seemed like the place to get my evening meal. I grabbed a local newspaper from the box outside on my way in and settled into a quiet booth where the hostess seated me. Not much was happening in the newspaper, and I didn't recognize any of the businesses or people written about. Quickly flipping to the classified advertisements, I saw there was a fully furnished trailer for rent in the park across from the warehouse I was interested in. The price seemed reasonable. Calling the listed number, a lady answered and said she would be happy to show it to me in the morning. I was about to put my cell phone away when I thought it might be a good idea to give my son a call and let him know I'd arrived okay. We chatted for a few minutes, and he let the cats hear my voice. I could hear them saying hello in their little kitty voices, and asked him to give them a wet food treat when we got off the phone. When I looked up, I was surprised to see a waitress standing beside me, waiting to take my order. Placing my order, I couldn't help but stare into her eyes, as there was something familiar there. When we were finished, I watched her take away my order to the kitchen and continue her rounds. At first, I couldn't figure out why she seemed so familiar to me, but soon noticed some familiar mannerisms. As I ate my meal, I continued to watch her while trying not to stare. This lady was familiar to me. Sure, she was probably someone's grandmother, but then I was also a grandfather. Leaving money for the meal and a tip on the table, I pointed it out to the waitress, gave her a nod, and walked into the quickly darkening night. A cool breeze was blowing in off Lake Michigan, carrying the scent of pine trees, and I breathed deeply. I felt very contented. After a hot shower, I climbed between the sheets and let myself drift into a very deep sleep. That night I had many dreams which I don't remember, but the last one brought me out of slumber. It was a patchy hit-or-miss recollection of the bike ride I had made over 40 years ago. The scenes of riding and reaching my destination were seemingly mixed between coming and going, right up until the last when I was looking into someone's eyes and realization hit me. I sat straight up in the bed as I understood the lady in the restaurant was none other than my old girlfriend. Now I understood why she was so familiar. I looked at the clock and found it was only 3 in the morning. I drifted back to sleep wondering about my unexpected discovery. I liked that restaurant, but deep down I felt betrayed and didn't really want to reconnect with her. She had shown no sign of recognizing me, probably because of the beard I now had. Funny how something from so long ago can still be with you. The trailer was situated perfectly on the front row of the park next to the entry drive. From inside, I could see the warehouse across the street. I rented it on a month-to-month basis, claiming I was new to the area and looking for work. The lady happily accepted my payment of first and last month's rent and a small security deposit. Utilities were included, so I wouldn't have to worry about any of that. After she left, I unloaded my truck and headed off to the grocery store for some supplies. Cooking my own meals would preclude any need to eat out, and I wouldn't have to deal with my ex-girlfriend. Once back at my temporary home, I rearranged the furniture to place the dining table in front of the windows in order to be able to use my computer and see out at the same time. I positioned a camera on the windowsill, pointed it at the warehouse, and connected it to my computer. It would allow me to watch the warehouse while appearing to be working on my computer. Almost immediately, I realized that the warehouse property was pretty run down and not used as much as I suspected. There were a lot of semi-trucks with trailers parked in the periphery, but also several large boats and motorhomes. There were also several pieces of heavy construction equipment and what looked to be leftover steel beams from construction projects. In all honesty, it looked more like a junk collector's warehouse or possibly a large repair shop. Maybe a large contractor's base of operations? A railroad track ran northeast in front of the trailer park and alongside the warehouse property across the street. If needed, I could walk the tracks to gain access to the large woods surrounding the warehouse. Across the railroad tracks was a very large cemetery. To the north of the trailer park was a small shopping center with a large grocery store, the same store where I had purchased my groceries. Trucking activity was heavy there, but the location put it just outside the nature area, across the railroad tracks from the warehouse and beside the cemetery. I pulled up the map on my computer and entered walkthrough mode. Positioning the cursor on the street in front of the warehouse, I could see a lot of details hidden from the camera in the window. The warehouse was L-shaped with what looked to be a 2-story home closer to the road. All of the newer vehicles were parked near the home, and it even looked like the second-story windows were open. The largest part of the warehouse at the back had only one entrance door at the far end away from the L. It was a large door and could easily fit the largest semi-truck and trailer inside. There were no windows or skylights visible on the structure as well. It was starting to get dark and I was getting hungry. I left the computer recording the camera and after making some dinner, sat in the living room to watch a little television while I ate. I needed time to process what I had seen. By the time I finished eating, I was starting to doubt that I had actually located a viable possibility for the city entrance. There had been no activity at the warehouse all day, and it didn't look like there would be any in the near future. I resolved to get back on the computer and study harder to try to detect a possible entrance. Putting my dishes in the sink, I was just turning toward the computer when the unmistakable sound of an 18-wheeler downshifting cut into the night. I sat at the computer and watched as the large truck pulled into the warehouse entrance. It nosed directly up to the large door, which seemed to open automatically. There were no lights in the warehouse, other than the truck's headlights, as it pulled fully inside and the doors closed behind it. I thought I saw a sliver of light just as the doors closed, but couldn't be sure. I was elated. If deliveries to the warehouse were only made during hours of darkness, there would be no need for auxiliary personnel to be explained away, as most people wouldn't even notice. With the shopping center close by, trucks entering and leaving the area would not even be given a second look. My resolve was returning as I again heard the sound of the truck and I watched as the same truck exited the warehouse. These guys must be really fast at unloading trucks, I thought, until I realized it was pulling a different trailer. This made even more sense, as now the driver wouldn't even be witnessing the unloading. He dropped his load and picked up a trailer to be dropped somewhere else. Nothing really to question if the driver wasn't in the know. I continued to watch the warehouse for the next couple of weeks and kept a journal of the comings and goings of the trucks in the night. 4 trucks arrived each week at varied times, but always after dark, and everyone left with the trailer dropped by the previous truck. Once I was certain of the truck schedules, I decided it was time to see if I could verify that supplies for the city were being trucked in. Dressing in camouflage clothing, I waited until after dark and took a walk. Walking up the street to the edge of the cemetery, I casually walked to the railroad tracks and followed them until I was out of sight of the warehouse and road. Ducking into the woods, I carefully made my way around to the back of the warehouse where the trees were closest to the building. Crouched in the shadows, I listened until I was sure it was quiet and slipped through the shadows next to the building. Moving slowly, I scanned the back of the building looking for a way to see inside. There were no windows and only one large door a little over halfway across the back. The sound of a truck downshifting broke the silence, and I watched the headlights swing around the trees to the side of the building as it approached the door. No sound could be heard from inside until the truck entered the building. I could clearly hear the sounds of the truck, but nothing else. As the truck maneuvered inside, I saw a flash of light above me and looked to see a vent with an idle fan blade. It was about 6 feet above my head. I looked around for a way to see inside and then remembered seeing a ladder leaning against the side of the building in one of the camera angles. After the truck left again, I listened but heard nothing inside the building. Quietly, I made my way around to the ladder and carried it back to the vent. Leaning it against the building, I climbed up and peered cautiously in. The lighting was dim at the door end of the building, but at the opposite end I was dismayed to see a variety of machine tools arranged along a conveyor system. The last trailer delivered was sitting open, half loaded, and I could see boxes being filled with machined parts. I eased down the ladder and made my way back to the woods. As I walked through the woods towards the cemetery, I considered what I had seen. The trucks were bringing cast metal parts from somewhere to be final machined before they were shipped out again. I silently cursed to myself at having been so caught up in my adventure that I only now realized some important things that had been right in front of my eyes. If the trucks had been bringing in perishable groceries for the city, the trailers would have been refrigerated. None of these were. Sometimes it's all too easy to convince oneself of things if we overlook details that would dissuade us. Hope can be blinding, I told myself as I made a cup of coffee and sat back at my computer to think. Maybe I was just being silly, and it really was a dream. As real as it felt, there has never been anything real to say it wasn't a dream except for what I believed. Looking at the map, I looked at the buildings and undisturbed forest to the east. That was another possibility. Or was it? I turned the computer off and went to bed. Sunlight shining through the window woke me about mid-morning. I had not set an alarm because I had no reason to. Laying there, I decided I would clean up the trailer and ask for my deposit to be mailed to my home in Texas. I would go home, satisfied that it was all a dream. When all was clean and the truck packed, I took a shower and was getting ready to dress when a thought occurred to me. I believe things happen for a reason. I came to Michigan to resolve something that had bothered me my whole life, and in doing so had discovered that I still harbored resentment of my ex-girlfriend because she couldn't wait for me. Perhaps she was not aware of this, and maybe, if she was, she didn't care. But it did bother me. I resolved to at least talk with her and find a way to let it go before I returned to Texas. Grabbing my shaving kit, I removed my beard and made my face clean-shaven except for a little bit of mustache like I had the last time she saw me. To my surprise, I looked 20 years younger. With a renewed bounce in my step, I locked the trailer and dropped the keys in the office drop slot with a letter requesting my deposit and headed for the country restaurant. Of course, I had no idea if she would be working this evening, but if she wasn't there, I could always inquire of the manager when she would be on duty and hang around till then. The hostess showed me to the same booth I had on my last visit, and I took a moment to call my son and let him know I'd be headed home soon. He seemed happy to hear from me and said he had been busy cleaning up the boat so we could go fishing when I got back. I told him that sounded good, and I would see him in a few days. I put the phone away and turned to see my ex standing there waiting to take my order. When I looked up and smiled, I saw her eyes get wide, and for a moment I thought she was going to scream. She smiled broadly and squealed with delight how happy she was to see me. She told me she would be off work in 30 minutes and asked if I would stay and talk with her. I placed my order and told her I would. I was just finishing my plate when she came over and sat at the booth with a carafe of coffee and a cup for herself. We talked for several hours about everything under the sun until the restaurant closed. I showed her pictures of my kids and grandkids, and she showed me hers. We shared stories about our lives, from the good times and bad as well. It was a most enjoyable visit. How I wish our last meeting had been. Standing by my truck saying goodbye, she stopped for a moment and just stared at me. Then I saw a tear in her eye and wondered what was wrong. She told me I'd always been in her heart, and she was sorry she couldn't wait for me. She apologized for hurting me and let me know that she had seen the hurt that night and heard about it from her family afterwards. I could feel tears trying to form, and a large lump rose in my throat. I told her I understood and pointed out that what is meant to be will be, and obviously, we had different paths to take. She smiled and said she expected me to say something like that because I was always kind to her. Then she asked if I was still writing. I hadn't written in such a long time, but I did recall one of the short stories I wrote long ago. I explained that after we went our separate ways, I was still stuck on her for a while, and I wrote a story called Love's Fury, in which I returned for her, but it was too late because she was taken from me. It was my way of dealing with the loss and finding an end. We said our final goodbyes, and I kissed her lightly on the cheek before getting in my truck. She watched me pull out of the parking lot and was still waving when I lost sight of her. Though it was late at night, I decided I would start heading back to Texas tonight and not stop until I was at least in Illinois. Then I would not be in Michigan or Indiana, where I had so many memories. But before I could go, I needed to refill my cooler with energy drinks and snacks, so I headed for the only grocery store I knew. I cast a glance across the cemetery to the old warehouse and chuckled to myself as I pulled into the shopping center. Thankfully, the grocery store was open all night and I had no trouble getting what I needed. As I rolled my cart past the stockroom door, I saw a couple guys pushing a large dolly with meat products out of a truck. It looked like hard work. Continuing along, I walked to the cooler section where the cold drinks were kept by the milk and meats. Then it dawned on me that the men were pushing the dolly in the opposite direction. I looked behind me, but there were no coolers or meat department that way. Curiosity got the better of me, and I left the cart for a moment while I walked back and poked my head in the door, looking toward where they went. There was only an empty warehouse that way, and no sign of the two men. I walked on in and headed in the same direction they went and found a large door in the corner. Just as I was reaching for the handle, the door opened and I was face to face with the two men and a woman with a clipboard. One of the men asked if he could help me, and I started to tell him I was looking for a restroom when the lady looked up from the clipboard. Her eyes got wide and she smiled as she rushed forward to wrap her arms around me, saying my name. "You said I could come back if I found a way, Leah," I said as I hugged her tightly. She took me by the hand and led me back through the door she had come from and into a hidden elevator. We rode down silently, and when the doors opened, I was absolutely amazed. It wasn't a dream after all. Thank you for spending your time with me. Tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll be sure to join in the conversation. Return to City Underground is my first news story for 2021. It will be included in my next volume of short stories, which I will be publishing later this year. That's all for tonight, but I'll be back next week with another tale from my collection. So, until then, sleep well.